Hi, and welcome to Leaders of the Jewel City. I'm Rich Wells, the Public Information Officer for the City of Glendale. Leaders of the Jewel City gives you an inside look into the decisions that help shape our city through the eyes of former mayors. In the coming months, we'll talk with these former city leaders about issues and projects they worked on during their term in office. Our guest this month is Jerold Milner, who served on the City Council from 1983 to 1991. Milner held the position of mayor from April of 1985 to April of 1986, and from April of 1989 to April of 1990. Jerry, during your 2 terms in office, talk about the makeup of those councils.
Well, when I was first elected in '83, Carol Parcher was the mayor, Jack Day was the chairman of the redevelopment agency, and Ginger Bremberg was starting her 3rd year on the council, and Larry Zarian and I were elected newly in April of '83. And then 2 years later, Carol Parcher did not run for re-election, and Carl Raggio came on, and then another 4 years after that, Jack Day retired, and Richard Jutra came on.
Now, let's talk about the city managers. You actually worked with quite a few city managers.
3 of them, yes.
Talk about them.
Well, when I first came, Hugh McKinley was here, and he was here for a couple of years, and then he retired, and we selected Jim Rez to be the new manager, and Rez was here for maybe 4 years before he retired, and then we selected Dave Ramsey. So I worked with 3 city managers.
Talk about the recruitment process.
Well, we went to the Burbank Hilton to be out of town and away from distractions, and we wanted to give our full attention to what we were doing. And we all agreed that we would ask, each of us would ask 2 questions of each candidate, and we would ask the same questions of each candidate. And then if there was something more that we wanted to ask, we could do so. But the first 10 questions were scripted. And I think that worked very well, because you get the personal answer
right
for the same question from several different people, and that's what you use as a basis for your selection.
Now, do you have that selection process for both Rez and for Ramsey?
Yes.
Talk about those 3 individuals. I imagine they all had their different styles, didn't they?
Yeah, obviously. Hugh was very, very professional. He had come here from San Diego.
Right.
He had been city manager in San Diego, and I think the politics in San Diego just got too much for him. And so he came up here, and when he left, Jim was the assistant city manager, and I think we had maybe 5 candidates besides Rez. And then when he left, we had 4 or 5, of whom Ramsey was one, and he had been the assistant city manager also. So the fact that both Jim and Dave had experience in the manager's office certainly was a plus for them. But we also thought that we had picked the right people. So
it really is an important process to pick a good city manager.
Oh yeah, it's the maybe the most important thing that we did was to pick new city managers.
Jerry, if you will, give me an idea of what Glendale was like and what was the community like back in the 80s.
Well, I have to go back and say I moved here in 1963. So I had lived here for quite a few years. My 2 children had each graduated from Hoover, and it was still pretty much the way it was when we moved here. And we had been transferred from the Bay Area. I worked for Pacific Telephone, and got moved down here. And I hadn't really seen much change in those years before I got on the council. But in the early 80s, we began to have an influx of people. The personality of the city changed rather dramatically at that time. And it presented some challenges that we had to face and do something about.
I wanted to ask you about that. What do you think were some of the more significant challenges that you were facing during that period of time?
Well, I go to my favorite, which is the downzoning to control the population size. And in the early 20s, when the U.S. Supreme Court approved the concept of zoning for cities, single-family residence, multiple family, industrial, commercial, those kinds of zones, the people on the city council at that time, 4 of the 5 were in the real estate business. And so they zoned almost all of the city of Glendale, which was the flat part at that time. They zoned that for multiple family dwellings. And the sales pitch was, you come and buy a lot in Glendale, build your California bungalow, raise your family, and when you're ready to leave and retire, you can sell that property for a lot more because it's zoned for multiple family. And nobody ever did anything about that. People came and did exactly what the real estate people wanted them to do. And when they got ready to leave, well, I better say, the people who were living there at the time in the early 80s thought they were in a single-family neighborhood. And some of the new people who were moving into town had a lot of money, and they would buy a house, and the next day there'd be a bulldozer there, knock it down, and they would build 12 housing units where there had been 1. And so our challenge was, how big can the city be? And nobody had ever asked that question before. And so in my naivete at the time, after being on the council for about 4 months, I asked the question. And the city manager had the planning department do a study, and they found out that the city at that time was about 160,000, but it could go up to about 350,000, more than double. And so we felt that in order to maintain some semblance of community as opposed to a high-rise city, that we would have to do something to restrict the amount of building that could go on. And the solution turned out to be downzoning, where we took R4 property and reduced it. Instead of being able to build 12 units on a 50 by 100 lot, you could only build 4. And of course there was a lot of gnashing of teeth by people who owned some of that property. But the end result, I think, is that everybody understood that we were trying to do something to plan ahead and help the city retain its character. And then we had to deal with mansionization, people building huge houses, and we Glendalians of old did not like anybody to tell them what to do. So we had front setbacks, side setbacks, and rear setbacks, and a height limit, and that was all. But we started having homes built that were a box. They put everything out to the limit, and that was it. And so we had to have 2 design review committees, 5 people on each, and getting one was difficult enough, but having 2 that were in concert with one another was very difficult. And we asked the planning department to be more discriminating in approving plans. And I don't know what the population is today, but I hope that we thought we would probably have a limit of 210,000. Mm-hmm. And as I was driving around before I came here, it must be pretty close to that. There's a lot of people.
Right. Well, it's about 207,000 today, so it's very close to the numbers that you were given back then in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And they had said, I think, projections would be about 225. So, but it's a lot less than the 350,000 that you were told back then that could have been the build-out if things would have continued on that way. Correct. Besides those issues, the downzoning issue and the mansionization issue, any other issues that were quite a challenge for you back then?
Well, as the redevelopment agency, we of course were dealing with a deteriorating Brand Boulevard and a lessening of, to be very frank, Glendale type businesses. And so at that time there was not a lot of demand for more office space, and we felt collectively that downtown Glendale should be an office center where people would come in and go to their office and work and then be out at noon for restaurants. And the Galleria was already there, so we wanted customers. And that's what we set out to do. We, through the agency and ultimately with the council, we approved the building of 8 high-rise buildings that are now in the original redevelopment area along Brand, and the hotel. And when I first came to Glendale, I said I was transferred from the Bay Area, and I was here for 3 months before my family came, and I had to live in a motel in Burbank because there was no place to stay in Glendale. So all that time, there was, in the years between 63 and 83, there was a lot of interest and effort put toward having a hotel. And so we were very pleased when Red Lion agreed that they would build a hotel. And we were even more pleased because we built the world's widest and shortest bridge across Verdugo Wash.
Right.
And that's the front of the hotel.
Right.
And they had to have that much extra space. So we got approval from the Corps of Engineers to span that 1 block long section of the wash, only 80 feet long, 80 feet across, but 300 and some feet wide.
That's
so
quite a job, wasn't it?
It was quite a job. And it was good. It was a good thing.
In the way of accomplishment, again, would that be what you were able to do with downzoning, or were there some other accomplishments that you're very proud of?
Well, I have to, in all humility, say yes, there are others, and also say that no one council member does anything. In the case of the downzoning, it required 4 of the 5 members to agree to it.
Right.
And so, as I said, 7.5 years, and a part of that was because I think I was the lead because I asked the question and ultimately made the basic suggestion, which was, of course, manipulated over time. But I really wanted to get that done before I left the council. And so it had to be taken slowly and with a lot of discussion and give and take. And but we got that done. Other things that I think were valuable was that we instituted the concept of public art in the redevelopment area, and I would say that my personal involvement in that is the statue that's at the main library. It's called Me Too.
Right.
The little guy hugging the legs of presumably his mother and father.
Right.
And I had met the artist through Bill Holderness, and she was very happy to work with us, and so we got that done. Two other things that I'm happy with. I suggested mini parks. There's one on Wilson and Adams, and one at Kenilworth and Milford. And in each case, a part of my motivation was making those pieces of ground into parks meant that there were 4 lots that would not have apartment houses on them. And so I'd have to admit that that was a part of my motivation. But I also thought that there are going to be other multiple family dwellings, and we don't want them to be without some green space. And as I drove by on Wilson this morning, I see that that park is pretty well used.
Right.
There were a lot of people there. And I did drive by the one on Kenilworth, and there was no one there, but at least it's there.
Well, and there are a lot of mini parks in Glendale these days.
Is there?
Oh yes, up and down the city.
Good.
So I think you started a trend there.
Well, I hope so. That's very comforting to know that.
Jerry, was there something in office that you had hoped to accomplish, but maybe you never finished it or didn't quite get to the point where you wanted to?
I would say got shot down. One of them was Dave Thompson was the chief of police, and he was also a member of the Kiwanis Club, Glendale Kiwanis, and so I knew him pretty well, and somewhere along the line, for whatever reason, he said he wished that he had more police officers, and so we got talking about it, and he could show me that a motorcycle officer in the course of his duties without going out of his way earned more for the city in a year than it cost us to keep him and his equipment. And so I proposed that we add 6 motorcycle officers, and the council went along with it, and so we increased the motor squad by 6 people, and then I talked to Dave about meter maids. Parking has always been a problem, and we had a few people who went up and down Brand and Central in the redevelopment area, but I found out from Dave that a meter maid could be male or female, but a meter, I don't want to say person, that's too politically correct. They could earn twice as much just writing citations for overtime parking. And I tried to get the council, or at least 2 others, to go along with me, and I couldn't do that. I'm sorry that I didn't, because I think that would have helped. Another one that also was directed toward the idea of controlling the population was that we knew that the people coming into the community would live 3-4 families in one unit, and of course each family had at least 1 car, and so there simply wasn't enough parking. And I proposed that we restrict overnight parking between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. And that there would be exceptions for which you could get a permit, but just to park your car on the street would not be allowed, and that would help not having multiple families in one unit that only had one garage or one parking place or maybe two. And I couldn't get that done. Nobody would agree with me on that. So that's the second big thing, I think, that was a disappointment.
Jerry, anything you wish you could have done differently when you were in office? If you look now that you look back, is there anything you would have done differently?
I don't think so. I've often thought how fortunate I was to be with the people I was with, those 6 people, 7 people. As I said, we didn't always agree, but we didn't rant and rave and make a big fuss over it. We just disagreed, and you voted your conscience. And that doesn't always happen in any legislative body, and especially when there are things that someone thinks needs to be done and someone disagrees completely. It can get out of hand very easily. But I was very fortunate with my colleagues and with the staff that we worked with, the city employees, management and non-management did a marvelous job, and I wouldn't change anything. I wouldn't change a thing.
One of your colleagues, previous colleagues, had mentioned the issue of Prop 13 really impacted the city. Would you agree with that?
No. Frankly, my opinion is that the 8 years that I was here, we had plenty of money. And one of the things that we were very proud of was the fact that we had no bonded indebtedness. And we had a lot of money in reserves, and I would admit that we spent it all. So if it was someone who served after me, he or she may very well have felt that there was a need for more tax income, but I certainly never felt that way.
Jerry, looking at the city back in the 80s when you were in office, you had a chance to drive around town today.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on the transition of Glendale from then until now?
Well, it obviously has more people and more automobiles. And I must admit that I have only been in the downtown area, this area, although I did go to Forest Lawn to visit my first wife's grave. But all of this flat area, and again, it's my bias, I'm sure, but I just felt there are too many people. And there are so many more apartment buildings as opposed to the single-family dwellings that used to be there. And certainly on the zoning that we put in, that's perfectly legal, and but it's just there are more people and more automobiles now.
Jerry, anything you can look back on and say, that was a really humorous moment when I was in office? Any thoughts along those lines?
Well, yeah, I'll tell you one that I think you might agree was humorous. Down here at Dunn Edwards on the corner of Broadway and Jackson, the idea developed that contractors or individuals would go by there early in the morning and buy paint, and the contract laborers would come. We had traffic problems on Broadway and Jackson because these people would stop and negotiate with the workers to come and work for them for the day. And so we finally decided that the only thing that we could do that was legal and might be effective was that we would prohibit parking from 6 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock in the morning around that intersection of Jackson and Broadway. And so we agreed to do that. And I was mayor at the time, and I thought it was my responsibility to go see how that was working. So I drove down there one morning about 7:30 and parked and talked to the sergeant who was in charge of the detail. And when I came back to my car, I had a citation. And so not only did I have to pay the citation, but my friend Chief Thompson told the president of the Kiwanis Club.
Oh, no.
So I paid twice at the Kiwanis Club and once at the city, and it cost me 3 times what the average person would do. And that was a joke on me.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
it was a dumb thing for me to do, but it never occurred to me that I was violating our own ordinance.
Jerry, what have you been doing since you left office?
Well, I left in '91 and decided that I wanted to change my place of residence. And so I started looking along the coast from Monterey down to San Diego. And I finally settled on Dana Point, where I live now. And I'm retired. When I moved into this community association, it's called Nagel Shores. Mm-hmm. And there are 960 homes in this community. And I have been on the board of directors for 8 years and president for 4 years. But my real interest and joy is traveling. Mm-hmm. And my first wife and I went to China in 1984 and to Russia in 1985, and then she passed away in '86. And in '87 I started traveling again, and I decided I needed goals. So I set as 3 goals: to be on each of the 7 continents, to be in at least 100 countries, and to be on each of the 20 longest rivers of the world. And my present wife and I have been on each of the 7 continents. We've been in 176 countries, and I've been on 19 of the 20 longest rivers.
Wow.
And
wow.
I think the 20th one will be my farewell to the earth, because it's the Congo River in West Africa. And I've inquired many times if I could get there, and the answer is always the same. It's very easy to get there. It's problematic getting out. Mm. So I told my son that when I knew I was terminal, I would buy a one-way ticket to someplace very exotic, and he would have to come and find me. And he said, "Dad, you're jumping to a conclusion." So I'm leaving the Congo for the last.
Mm. Do you enjoy traveling?
I love traveling. I love traveling. If I haven't been there, I want to go. Hmm. And if I've been there, I don't want to go back.
Jerry, how would you like to be remembered?
Well, I think just being remembered would be an achievement. As I think I've said, my efforts in downzoning, that's one thing I'd like to be remembered for. I also suggested at one time, when the state law said the redevelopment agencies had to spend a certain percentage of their income on housing for low-income people, and I had been very involved with the Salvation Army in town, and so I suggested to the Salvation Army people that we work together, and the end result is the apartment complex where the Salvation Army is now, Central and between Windsor and Garfield, I think it is, and I don't think that would be there if I hadn't come up with the idea. I don't know, that may be it. One other, when the county built a new bridge where Brand crosses Verdugo Wash, we had to dress that up a little bit. And I suggested to Rez that we have 3 flagpoles for the U.S. flag and the state flag and the city flag, and that to make them unique, each of them has a different filial at the top. The eagle for the U.S., and a bear for the state of California, and a jewel for Glendale, the Jewel City. So those things, I think, if anybody remembers me at all, for any one or all of them, that would be very nice.
Oh, those are great.
Yeah.
Those are great. Well, Jerry, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to drive all the way up here today and join us and share your memories and your stories with us. It's been
thank you for asking me to do this, and I'm grateful that I'm still able to do it.
Well, we are too, and it's been education for me, and I'm sure it has been for our viewers as well. So thank you very much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Rich.